All persons having anything to do before the Honorable, the Justices of the Appeals Court, now sitting at Boston, within and for the Commonwealth. Draw near, give your attendance, and you shall be heard. God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This court is open. Please be seated.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this very special memorial sitting of the Appeals Court here in Boston. We are here post-pandemic at long last to pay honor and tribute in memory of our deceased former colleague, George Jacobs. With me on the bench for this sitting are, and I'm starting to my right and your left, retired Appeals Court Justice Jim McHugh, who joins this panel at the request of the Jacobs family. He sat with Judge Jacobs on the Superior Court and on this court before his retirement in 2012. Retired Chief Justice Christopher Armstrong, who will be speaking on behalf of the court at the end of these proceedings. To my left and your right, former Appeals Court and current Supreme Judicial Court Justice Elspeth Cipher, and current Appeals Court Justice and Justice Jacobs' son-in-law, Peter Sachs. On behalf of the panel and the other justices of the Appeals Court, current and retired, who of necessity, by virtue of their numbers, are in the well rather than joining us on the bench, I welcome the members of the Jacobs family, especially Justice Jacobs' wife, Lois, his son, Ron, and Ron's wife, Judy, and their sons, Justin and Lucas, and Justice Jacobs' daughters, Sandy, and her husband, Mark Friedman, and Debbie, Justice Sachs' wife. I also want to recognize former SJC Justices, Justice Judy Cowan, current SJC Justice and former Appeals Court Chief Justice Scott Kafker, and Justice Dalila Wendland, formerly of this court, no, she's not here, who honor us and Justice Jacobs by their presence here today. I also want to make special recognition of the attendance of Justice Jacobs' former secretaries, Marie Cardinal and Cheryl Miranda. Before I invite the Attorney General to present her motion, I want just very briefly to offer my own personal reflection on Justice Jacobs. When I joined this court in 2001 as part of that expansion, Justice Jacobs was among those most welcoming to me. He made special efforts, for whatever reason, to take me under his wing and mentor me, not just on the decisional work of the court, but on its operations. He became a dear friend, and his presence looms so large in my memory that it's surprising for me to realize that we served together for less than 2 years before his constitutionally mandated retirement in 2003. It is a distinct honor for me personally to preside over this memorial sitting. I now formally begin this proceeding by inviting the Attorney General of the Commonwealth, Andrea Campbell, to present a motion for consideration by the court.
Chief Justice Green, members of the court, may it please the court, on behalf of the Attorney General's office and the Bar of the Commonwealth, it is my honor and my privilege to present a memorial and tribute to the late George Jacobs, who served as an Associate Justice of this court. George Jacobs was born in Milan, Italy in 1933. The only child of Jacob and Frances Jacobs, who originated from Galicia, Poland, currently Ukraine. They fled religious persecution in Europe and settled in New Bedford in 1938 when George was 5 years old. He made lifelong friends while attending New Bedford's public schools and was president of New Bedford High School class of 1951. After attending Harvard College and Harvard Law School, he returned to New Bedford and worked as a private practice lawyer from 1958 to 1975. He served as city solicitor for New Bedford from 1964 to 1970 under Mayor Edward Harrington, and then as Assistant Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts from 1970 to 1974 under Robert H. Quinn. He met Lois Betty Meyer at the New Bedford Jewish Community Center, where he had various jobs while he was a student. He told beautiful Lois, if she got into college in Boston, he would take her out to dinner. They began dating when Lois enrolled at Brandeis University as a first-year student, and he was a student at Harvard Law School. They were married on August 31st, 1958. They celebrated 61 years of marriage, and are the proud parents of Deborah Jacobs and her husband, of course, Justice Peter Sachs, daughter Sandra Jacobs and her husband, Mark Friedman, and son Ronald Jacobs and his wife, Judith Jacobs, and 6 grandchildren, Justin, Lucas, Molly, Jake, Anna, and Jonathan. George Jacobs had a general law practice in New Bedford, sharing an office with high school and college classmates, Alan Novick and Harvey Mickelson. In the late 1960s, he joined Maurice Downey in the first law partnership between a Catholic lawyer and a Jewish lawyer in New Bedford. He was appointed to the probate court by Governor Michael Dukakis in 1975, Superior Court by Governor Edward King in 1978, eventually serving on the Superior Court for 11 years until he was elevated to the Appeals Court in 1989 as an Associate Justice, where he filled seat number 5, formerly occupied by the late Justice Donald Grant, one of the court's original appointees. He acclimated quickly to appellate work. During his 14 years on the Appeals Court, he earned a reputation as a prolific writer of decisions and as a superb colleague and friend to every employee. He produced a total of 170 written decisions, of which 167 were signed opinions, 2 concurrences, 1 dissent. After mandatory retirement from the court at age 70, he became a full-time professor at what is now UMass Dartmouth Law School from 2003 to 2018, and as a mediator at the Mediation Group in Brookline. He was active in New Bedford's Jewish organizations and served as a trustee of the South Coast Hospitals Group and St. Luke's Hospital. He was known in diverse circles for his integrity and humility, for his egalitarian spirit, his imperturbable temperament, and a sense of humor. Many considered him to be a role model for other judges, for his intellect, his fairness, and his humanity. He was the first recipient of the St. Thomas More Ecumenical Medal awarded by the Fall River Diocese at its Red Mass in 1997. He was a co-author with Justice Kenneth Lawrence of Volume 51, Professional Malpractice of the Massachusetts Practice Series. He was quietly proud of what he accomplished as an immigrant kid from New Bedford, and very proud to be an American. As he liked to say, what a country. On July 7, 2020, at the age of 86, he passed away peacefully at his home with his family nearby. Mr. Chief Justice, it is an absolute honor and an incredible privilege to be here today to pay tribute to Justice Jacobs, a truly outstanding judge and human being whose commitment to public service is an example to the entire legal profession. On behalf of the Bar of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I respectfully move that this memorial be spread upon the records of the Appeal Court. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will hold your motion for action pending further presentations, the first of which will come from my colleague to the left, Justice Cipher, who, like Justice Jacobs, hails from the South Coast and shared many rides up to Boston. She will be presenting some reflections of her own before presenting the reflections of his longtime law clerk, Richard Pline.
Thank you very much. First, I'm just very grateful to be here today and honored to read Richard Pline's remarks for him in a minute. But first, I just had a few things I want to say, and the first is that, boy, it feels good to be in this courtroom. It really does.
Welcome back.
George Jacobs was a legend in Bristol County. As a longtime resident of New Bedford, he touched the lives of thousands through his work for the city as a judge in the probate and family court and as a Superior Court judge. I first encountered Judge Jacobs in Superior Court, where I was trying to fend off a motion for new trial in 2 first-degree murder cases. It was a futile effort, as I gradually learned while Judge Jacobs questioned me. When I brought his memorandum of decision to the district attorney that said we had to have a new trial, and I said, well, should we appeal? He said, no. If Judge Jacobs said we need a new trial, then that's what we need. That's what we'll do. Soon after, he was appointed to the appeals court and set his office up in New Bedford with his law clerk, Richard Pline. I was always nervous when I argued in front of Judge Jacobs at the appeals court because I cared very much what he thought, and I knew that if I was really terrible, or if I slipped, or if I couldn't answer a question, that a discreet conversation might be had with the district attorney on the golf course. When I joined the appeals court, George became a peer, but I found it so hard not to call him Judge Jacobs. He also was my mentor, and he helped me how to learn how to write opinions. And for a while, he was my driver. He would pick me up at my house at 5 a.m. in New Bedford on the mornings that we had court together. And as we went to Boston, he would give me the secret shortcuts to the city. That was part of his mentoring. He also patiently explained to me on the one and only one occasion that he let me drive was that I needed to go faster and I needed to keep changing lanes or I would contribute to traffic. He had his way, and I had my way of driving, and he never let me drive again. And I do say let me drive because he did express to me his opinion of women drivers, not just me. He also always made sure we were out of this courthouse before 3 o'clock, preferably before 2:45, or we would be stuck in the Southeast Expressway for hours. And he also showed me the quickest way out of the city. What I learned from spending time with George in the car that I would like to pass on. First, his family was the most important part of his life. He loved his wife Lois so dearly, and he would often express concern, I wouldn't say worry, but concern about her happiness and comfort. That was a priority for him. He also loved his children deeply and was very, very proud of them. And he was proud of their spouses and their children. And I know Judge Sachs, he would have been especially proud of you here on the appeals court. One day, or it could have been 5 a.m. for all I know, or 2:45, he told me a story about his son when he was a teenager. And his son was out late at night with some friends, and he was worried. But he did not want to ruin a good time. And he did not want his son to believe he wasn't trusted. So he had a local police officer drive him around the city until they located the house, peeked in the window, saw all was well. So the officer then returned George home, and he was able to go to sleep. You never know what somebody's going to say to you in the car on a long trip. Second, George was a sincerely compassionate person. When I heard him express regret, it was usually because he had thought of something that he had said, and he thought, oh, I wasn't understanding enough of them, or maybe they'd had a bad day, and I was too sharp with that attorney at oral argument, or maybe I should have been better with a difficult judge. And then finally, the final point I want to mention is I learned from George Jacobs how much he respected and cared for his longtime clerk, Richard Pline, and also how he came to cherish Cheryl Miranda as his assistant, and of course, Maria Cardinal. As retirement came closer and closer, he had me work with Richard on a couple of cases so we could see if we could work together. He wanted me to continue Richard's employment at the court, and so I did. And that was, in fact, a very, very good deal for me. But I always felt that I was letting Richard down because I was not George Jacobs. George Jacobs, the man and the judge, was loved and respected. He left a major imprint on the Bristol County community and the statewide legal community. Those of us who were able to spend time with him were given a great gift, always thoughtful and considerate of anybody that he was dealing with, be they someone who worked for him, somebody he didn't know, somebody he might even be mad at. He was always thoughtful and considerate and kind. George Jacobs had a brilliant legal mind and a shining, expansive heart, and he is terribly missed. And that concludes my remarks. Now we'll hear from Richard, who's unfortunately not able to come today. These are remarks by Richard Pline to be read at the memorial service for George Jacobs. I'm grateful for the opportunity to add some remarks to this memorial celebration about my long relationship with George Jacobs as his law clerk and as his friend. I deeply regret I am unable to attend in person, and I send my heartfelt regards to Lois and all of his family. I had known George in his role as city solicitor when I worked as director of community development for the city of New Bedford. After leaving the city, I went to law school, and having passed the bar exam at the age of 58, was doing some part-time legal work for an attorney in town. Walking downtown on my way back from lunch one day, George wheeled up beside me in his car, rolled down the window, and said if he was appointed to the appeals court, he would like to select me as his law clerk. This began the best 13 years of my work as his clerk and a deepening of a profound friendship with one of the finest men I've ever known. At his swearing in the appeals court, George spoke of his debt to his family and friends and the area he grew up in after coming to New Bedford from Italy in 1938. Because of that commitment to the area, George immediately established that he intended for us to work from New Bedford and arranged to set up a modest office in the Superior Court building. George knew the resources necessary to do his job were available locally, and it would be much more efficient to concentrate on the work rather than spend hours commuting out of town. His office raised the visibility of the appeals court in New Bedford and additionally provided a boost for the local legal community. He also promoted the growing trend of the appeals court holding hearings throughout the state outside of Boston. George placed a high priority on developing and maintaining excellent relationships with the other justices, some of whom he considered to be giants in the formation of the court. On many occasions, he included me in conversations when he met with some of these justices and never made me feel out of place. Always a champion of New Bedford, George took an active role in working with the law school established in the New Bedford and Dartmouth area. He asked to have his swearing in as an appeals court judge to be in his hometown at the then Southeastern Massachusetts University, which was known as SMU, and later he began teaching there at what would become the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth Law School. He worked closely with Dean Robert Ward, who is here today, and helped in any way he could to put that law school in a better position, and I would say that all of his efforts and all of Dean Ward's efforts have made a very big contribution to that effort. He was asked to be the speaker for the 100th anniversary of the New Bedford Bar Association. It has been very difficult for me to summarize a relationship that is still deeply felt and greatly missed. I want to thank the court for holding this memorial today.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Richard. Richard, as Justice Cipher mentioned, can't be with us today, but he is watching online through our live stream to YouTube. And Richard, those are beautiful remarks. Next on our program is my colleague, Justice Peter Sachs. He will be providing the first of two perspectives from the perspective of the family, but his from the unique perspective of an in-law. Justice Sachs.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you for being here, one and all, colleagues, friends, and may I welcome some additional extended family members, Dick and Vivian Marson, John and Ina Portnoy, and Rachel Daly, who's also a member of the bar, carrying on a fine family tradition. I feel fortunate to be able to say that George Jacobs was my father-in-law, and that after I met George and Lois's daughter, Debbie, in 1995, and after we married in 1997, I was welcomed into the family. George shared a lot of wisdom with me over the years. Today, I'll share a few things he said that had to do particularly with the law. George was actually the first member of the Jacobs family I met, or perhaps encountered is a better word given the setting, which was when I appeared as a lawyer before him in the appeals court in the early 1990s. And I recall that at oral argument, he had a wonderful way of inviting the sort of dialogue between the judges and the lawyers that is everyone's ideal for what an oral argument should be. On one occasion, I was making some point that he evidently didn't think held much water, and his expression on his face showed that a little bit, but he said to me, and it only works if one's voice has the sort of gravitas that his did and mine never will, but he said to me, "Come, let us reason together." Which another judge might have phrased, "Cut the..." But he proceeded to ask a series of short and simple questions in a very calm and conversational tone, yet very much in control. He made me feel like I could, and indeed that I had better, give up on some of my more aggressive arguments, because I could feel confident that with him at least, common sense would ultimately rule the day. He just cleared away the underbrush of the case, and by the time the argument was over, I think everyone in the courtroom thought the answer, the correct result in the case was obvious. So obvious, in fact, that the resulting decision was deemed unworthy of publication, which has made it impossible for me to find the decision after all these years. I don't remember what the case was about or who won it. What I do remember is his gentle approach, summed up in those words, "Come, let us reason together." It seemed at the time as if he was quoting some poem or proverb, but I had no idea what it might be. I looked it up recently and learned that it's from the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah, and that the Hebrew word for "let us reason together," yakach, means to decide, adjudge, prove, and argue. So it was particularly apt for the occasion, which I'm sure he knew, although I didn't have a clue. So once I became a family member, we would sometimes discuss decisions of other courts, some near, some far. On one occasion, I was expressing to him my admiration for what seemed to me to be the absolutely flawless logic of a decision in a criminal case. And he shook his head regretfully and told me quietly that he thought the author of the decision had, in his words, no understanding of human weakness. And that really got me thinking. So is that essential to being a judge? You mean it's not just an intellectual exercise? At that time, I was working in the Attorney General's office, representing state agencies, and so I didn't have many chances to work an understanding of human weakness into the sometimes rather bureaucratic arguments that I was making on behalf of my state agency clients. But George's thought about human weakness stayed with me, and I think I'm a better judge. I hope I'm a better judge and a better person for it. In the late 1990s, after years of seeing the green advance sheets every week with long lists of the unpublished Rule 128 decisions of this court, I asked him, does it ever get old? If the decisions aren't being published, how interesting can they be? And he said he always felt a great sense of anticipation when the briefs for the next month's sitting were delivered to him. In those days, they came in tall stacks of manila envelopes, not in megabytes or gigabytes onto our iPads, as they do today. And as he put it, he would happily contemplate that stack of manila envelopes and imagine to himself what fascinating problems might await him inside each envelope. And of course, each case was very important to the parties, even if no one else. Every case was an opportunity to solve a problem, and every case had something interesting in it. And that has certainly proven to be true in my time here. Finally, I recall what he said to me after my first day of hearing arguments as an appeals court judge in 2016. I asked if he had any advice for me. And he said, don't let the perfect, and I thought to myself, okay, I know where this is going. But no, that wasn't it at all. He said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the fair, which he never explained further, probably because he thought I'd understand it better if I figured it out for myself. I think what he meant was, yes, every case presents some intellectual puzzle, but don't fool yourself into thinking you're doing your job just by solving the puzzle. You can come up with a beautiful logical structure, but it doesn't necessarily produce a result that's just or fair or that anyone should feel good about. Take account of human weakness. and remember to reason together, to listen. Listen not just to your own brain or to your own gut, but listen to the lawyers, listen to your colleagues on the bench, and listen to the others here at the court who he felt so privileged to work with, and I feel privileged to work with. And work with them to find common ground that makes common sense. We should all be so lucky as to have someone like Justice George Jacobs in our professional and our personal lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking now in further support of the Attorney General's motion on behalf of the bar is Attorney Harvey Mickelson, a lifelong friend of Justice Jacobs.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, it's indeed been a pleasure to be here, to be with everybody at this particular time. And there's very little that I can possibly add to all the wonderful things that have been said about George. And I say George intentionally and not disrespectfully to the achievements, the judgeships, and all that went with it. I know George is George. 80 years of George. I don't know anything about courts with George or cases with George. I just know him as my buddy. That's all he was. So I want to thank you very much for suggesting that I be part of this event and thinking about what I should say or could say, somewhat what I could say about George. I consider that I'd go back to basics. It all began at the Betsy B. Winslow School grounds 80 years ago. We were both in kindergarten, first grade, living on opposite sides of Bedford Street in New Bedford, Massachusetts, with the school in between. And somehow, but I can't tell you exactly the date or the time, we got together. Something happened. And it's been kind of that way ever since. So who was this guy? I can only think of him as George Jacobs, my friend. Down to earth, considerate, affable guy. Never attempted to impress anybody with his accomplishments. Laid back, sincere, just involved with others and not necessarily the accomplishments of his life or the outward appearances of the accomplishments of his life. What he appeared to be when you first met him is what he was. As the years passed by, we were good friends and playmates almost every day. After school in those days, you probably remember it. You know, you went in the morning, then you went home, you had lunch, you went back to school in the afternoon. So there were periods in between playtime. Well, in those days, you played. You played baseball, you played in the schoolyard, you made use of time. You didn't sit with your computer because you didn't have one. So we continued that relationship of being very, very close for almost 80 years. And as we progressed through this elementary school, we became closer and closer, and we even became champions of the grammar school step ball league. It was important. Now, our achievements were well recognized. In case you didn't know, the equipment for this game was an old tennis ball and sometimes a broken broom handle. But we were good, and we were champs. And we had a good time. And those years included, unfortunately or fortunately, World War II. Perhaps some of you are old enough to remember that, maybe. And lunchtimes and during the day, we somewhat, not really think about it, but we spent time collecting newspapers and picking milkweed pods, which were brought to school, counted out, and somehow contributed to the war effort. I think the pods for parachutes and the newspapers I never really understood. But anyways, that's what we did for fun and for running around. I hope not to bore you with this, but this is my relationship with George. I don't know about judges. I really don't. My buddy. In the afternoon, every once in a while, there would be an air raid drill. Now, air raid drills in those days, you went under the desk or they ran you down cellar, and it was really, to me, kind of a game. But I often wondered what impact they had on George, having come from Europe at the time that he did. I did a little bit of research and found 1938, when he left Italy, that the Nazis were just made their relationship close with Mussolini, and he decided it's Jew time, in plain English. And so he must have been absorbed in that type of an atmosphere, even at 5 years old. George probably knew about it when he was 2, because he was so damn smart. As the years passed, we were good friends and playmates. That relationship went on through the school system until we went to New Bedford High School together. At that point, I befriended a girl named Bernice, who later became my wife and who died many years later. Through her and the growth of a gang of friends, I began to learn more of George's background, being a little more cognizant of not just playing around, although I did plenty of that too. When his mother and father and he escaped from Italy, thank goodness, in the 30s and came to the United States, they were welcomed by an uncle who lived in Fall River, Mass. And eventually they settled in New Bedford, on Bedford Street, close to my house. When they came, they were befriended by Bernice's mother and father, and they spent a great deal of time. It was a very small community at that point of people that were just leaving Europe, had to leave Europe and come to the United States. So they were being, to some extent, assimilated into the Jewish culture in New Bedford, in the United States, European background, brand new, and they were welcomed. And that family happened to consist of 11 children. And Bernice was youngest of 11, and George was her playmate. The Handler family welcomed the Jacobs family, and they spent a lot of time together and a lot of meals and a lot of understanding, I'm sure, and Bernice and George were very close. She often told me how smart he was, how many languages he could speak, and they had a bond, a very close bond until she passed away. And George somehow always maintained that relationship with that family of those 11 children, some of whom I stayed friendly with they're all gone now. But always, whenever I spoke to George, during the course of some time, he'd always ask about the Handler people. Those were days that were wonderful, how they spent those days together. And it was like a circle of the school to Bernice, back to George. Here I was, back again. George lost a dear friend, and he remained mine for 40 years. We're very close. George would always ask me how they were doing. He maintained an affection for the family and often referred to them. Throughout the high school years, George achieved at all levels. After school in the afternoon, he worked at the Jewish Community Center in New Bedford, where, all the gang would go to socialize after high school. And even at that stage of his life, his leadership qualities, administrative abilities, his personality, and his basic good nature was impressive, to say the least. Those that had the opportunity to be in contact with him, whether adolescent or adult, could easily see this guy was smart, really smart. Most of us weren't really smart. George, of course, went off to Harvard, which was not a shocker to anybody. And I went off to prep school, and that wasn't a shocker to anybody. But somehow I ended up at Harvard also. Don't ask me how. Those years went by quickly, and I would see George from time to time, excuse me, but somewhere, sometime in the conversation, there would be a reference to the old days, to the community center, not his new judgeship, not the cases, not what he has achieved, right back to basics. Those were the subjects of our conversation, never changed. When I was admitted to the bar in 1959, George was practicing as an attorney in New Bedford and asked me whether I'd like to share his offices with him. And we did practice together for 5 years. During that time, George was being more and more recognized for his ability and was attracting very significant clients. When I say significant, those clients that could provide a continuity of services for him and paid. Those were good clients. During that time, George was just attracting a lot of people. Those were good, pleasant years. We were never partners, but always supported each other in every way. It was just, if you had to be in that situation, which I don't mean negatively, it was the perfect place to be. George came to me one day and said, you know, Javier, I got to talk to you. And I said, what is it? And he told me that he was approached by the city solicitor of the city of New Bedford. And the gentleman, well recognized, Dad was an excellent lawyer, that he wanted him to be his assistant and also to join him in his law practice as a partner. George was not, heavily involved in politics, but he had achieved a great deal of recognition as a practicing attorney. And the addition of him to the city solicitor's office was a real plus. It gave them the expertise that it lacked in it. His partnership in the new firm created a more powerful and respected entity. It was a huge opportunity for him at the time. He would have gotten there anyways, wherever he wanted to go, but this was an opportunity. George asked me how I felt about it and whether it would interfere in our relationship and hurt my practice. I told him that in fairness to him and his family, and strictly for their benefit, he had to make the change. Very few people would have been concerned with my business and my future in that particular situation, because this was a turning point, prospectively a turning point. That's George. Onward to marriage, kids, law practices, judgeships, our relationship and our understanding of each other were the important things. And that relationship never changed, right to the last moment. I had boats for many years, and George and Lois would stay on board with us for a week or so every summer. And George said to me one day, I never had a bad day on your boat, you know that? And I can stand here and tell you that I never had a bad day with George Jacobs. And I spent a lot of days with him. George never really changed. We had a mutual friend, kind of a funny guy, and he used to refer to George as Giuseppe. It was kind of it was this guy who was a judge, who was sitting where you people are, and this little guy is talking to him, it's Giuseppe, and it didn't change. That's what he called him 30 years ago in the schoolyard, Giuseppe. And they would laugh and joke about it, but that's the way he was. There was nothing that was in any way pompous or objectionable in him. He just didn't have it. He's just that kind of a guy. As the decades passed and our children came and went and the paths and occupations developed, There were years that I didn't see much of George, but we would finally bump into each other, and I instantly knew that all that was important in our relationship in the formative years was still very much intact. And our meetings were filled with the same concerns for each other, our families, the kids, business, and more importantly, how are you really doing? Never mind the rest of the stuff. I knew and readily told anybody that would listen that George was the only real friend I had or ever wanted. I could go on for hours relating to incidents that occurred in our lives during those 80 years. But each story would project that George to me was always the kid from the neighborhood, the close friend of our family, and the quiet, unassuming, caring, and sensitive human being who documented his life with goodness and caring. Even in the waning years of his life, he always reached out to me and made certain that I was aware of his medical problems, the impact that it made on him, and even one night called me about 8:30, 8:45 at night to inform me that he was going in an ambulance the next day from Dartmouth to Boston Hospital, and he didn't want me to worry if I couldn't reach him. We managed to talk to each other often after he moved to Needham, with the same concerns for each other involved in every conversation. I told his son, Ron, that I was going to miss him, and indeed I do. So in closing again, I just want to thank all of you thoughtful enough to allow me to participate in this occasion that I believe appropriately completes the career of George as a judge. Each endeavor that George participated in concluded with him leaving an outstanding reputation and the fond memories of him for those who participated with him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney Mickelson. I don't think I'm breaking any impartiality by observing that at this point in the proceedings we've heard a fair body of support for the Attorney General's motion, but we do have one more speaker to hear from, and that is his son, Ronald Jacobs, and invite Mr. Jacobs to the podium.
Thank you. Since this is a formal proceeding being recorded for some posterity, I do, just before I get to my remarks, want to clarify one thing for the record, which is the night that my dad came with the cops, I didn't have a curfew. I wasn't breaking any rules.
He wasn't angry with you.
That was on
He
him.
was worried.
Statute of limitations has run.
Thank you. Thank you. Brought a smile to hear that story. As you've heard, I'm here to speak on behalf of my family, many of whom are in attendance. You've heard a couple of times who that is. And also for our four grandchildren who could not be here today, Molly, Jacob, Anna, and Jonathan. We all thank you for this opportunity. My father's accomplishments were many and varied and remarkable, even without taking into account his very humble beginnings here in this country. But his remarkable accomplishments are not what sum him up for us, his family. Rather, it was his devotion to us, an overwhelming instinct to protect us, his egalitarian spirit and distaste for pretense, his independence and self-reliance, his equanimity and imperturbable temperament, his humility, and of course, sometimes regretfully, his sense of humor, and perhaps most notably, the fact that none of his success, as far as we know, ever came at the expense of anyone else. It's difficult to imagine a purpose in life for which my father was better suited than being a judge, whether in the different contexts of the probate court, where he was first appointed at the young age of 42, the Superior Court next, or then this court where he sat until mandatory. The capacity incisiveness, and versatility of his intellect, combined with his temperament, and perhaps above all, his fundamental sense of fairness and reasonableness, made him perfectly suited for the role of judge. I also think it's fair to say that my father did not set out on the path that ultimately found him. Actually, I think in his heart of hearts, he envisioned himself as playing second base for the Red Sox. One of the many things that I can thank him for was having learned at a very young age the foolishness of such a goal. I went in a completely different direction and instead set out to be point guard for the Celtics. It says here, pause for laughter. And he supported my pursuit in that regard by reminding me appropriately and repeatedly to keep studying. What we, his family, heard the most from him about his time on the different courts and saw in practice was how much he enjoyed the camaraderie and company of those with whom he worked. Certainly the other judges whose legal skill and intellect he admired, but definitely not only them. He relished and valued his relationships with the clerks and other administrative staff, court reporters, court officers, and the various courthouse personnel. It sounds trite, but treating all people the same, regardless of background or station in life, was something we saw from him without exception and also without fanfare. Maybe this was the influence of starting in this country as an outsider. I was particularly close to my father and was most fortunate to spend a lot of time with him in many different contexts. His comportment in this regard was genuine and unwavering. To me, that is perhaps his greatest legacy. Now, at this point, he'd probably be telling me to wrap it up and land the plane already. And before I do, I want to repeat one thing that someone said to me the day before my father's funeral, now almost 3 years ago. This was a highly accomplished and respected person by any measure. He said that he could only hope, on his very best day, even for just a moment, to be just a little bit like my father. My father was asked dozens of times to perform weddings, deliver eulogies, other speeches, and the like. We found one of his eulogies and think it most appropriate to include his own words, which he delivered in memory of another. Quote, "If measured by the memory of those who loved him, who respected him, who worked with him, who laughed with him, and were inspired by him, his life was truly full and everlasting." Close quote. That my father, an immigrant, found a calling to which he was so well suited, being a judge, a position of such obvious honor and prestige, while adhering to the ideals by which he consistently led his life, and all without any sort of advantage beginning whatsoever, exemplifies many different elements of the American dream. Indeed, as he would say, and very often did say, what a country. Thank you.
Thank you. I now turn to my distinguished colleague and friend, our former Chief Justice Chris Armstrong, to deliver remarks on behalf of the court.
Mrs. Jacobs, Lois, and his family, Attorney General Campbell, and former members of the SJC who are here in the well and on the bench. It's a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you and speak for the court that I headed back at the time when George Jacobs was on it. George came to the appeals court shortly after the start of the 17th court year. The appeals court, then, as always, mired in backlog, would be without the services of Judge Don Grant, one of the court's 6 original members and one of our most productive, who had submitted his resignation to the governor in the spring of 1988, so as to give the Judicial Nominating Commission time to have a replacement in place for the start of the 16th court year in 1988-89. But Don Grant's position had lain vacant that entire court year. So the court entered the 1989-1990 court year with only 9 judges in active service. Then, shortly after the start of the 1989-1990 season, an unanticipated second vacancy arose. Supreme Court Chief Justice Edward Hennessy had reached the mandatory retirement age in April of that year, and he had been made to retire from the judiciary. His replacement came in June 1989, Paul Liakos, who had been an associate justice for, I believe, around 11 years, and he replaced Chief Justice Hennessy as the new Chief Justice of the SJC. That elevation left an associate justice vacancy in the SJC, and the appeals court Chief Justice John Graney was elevated to the SJC position on September 5. That appointment left vacant the position of Chief Justice of the Appeals Court. 4 candidates were considered, all associate judges of the Appeals Court. The governor selected Judge Joseph Warner to be the new chief, leaving, of course, a second vacancy in the position of associate justice. So the Appeals Court was down 2 judges, 2 vacancies. Then in 1988, the legislature had recognized the court's problem of unbelievable backlog and addressed it by authorizing 4 additional associate justice positions. Thus, by the autumn of 1989, the appeals court should have had 14 judges in active service. But the fact of the matter was, we had only 8. We had 6 vacancies and a hopeless backlog of cases waiting to be heard. That was the court to which George Jacobs was appointed in November 1989. I'm surprised he took the job. From the court's point of view, I speak here for the 8 of us who were active judges at the time. We had every reason to be optimistic about the appointment. Our new associate obviously had an extensive, well-rounded background, a background whose breadth exceeded any the court had ever had. The closest match was probably Alan Hale. A background that included time in private practice, which I had never had any time in private practice. Time as corporation counsel down in New Bedford. Time in the Attorney General's office as Assistant Attorney General under Bob Quinn. He had been probate judge, Superior Court judge, and came with a reputation for quiet excellence. Only Alan Hale had had experience as corporation counsel. no one had ever served in both Superior Court and the probate court. And that, by the way, is, I think, true to this day. That was a unique qualification that George had. So what more could we ask? Our hopes were more than amply fulfilled. George turned out to be all that we expected and more. He took a full judicial load, was infallibly punctual with his work. He was an excellent scholar and lawyer, a book lawyer. And he had very sound judgment. And a contagious sense of humor. And beyond the sheer load of casework, he plunged deeply into the chronic administrative problems of the appeals court, the ever-present problem of how to get current in the work, made creative suggestions. No one spent more time thinking through the appeals court's chronic problem of second panel and how to handle disagreements between panels of the court. So far as personal qualities go, George was perfectly matched to the role he played at a difficult time in the court's history. His infallibly good nature surmounted all personal difficulties on any panel that he sat on. His brilliance, I think, and he was unquestionably a brilliant lawyer, but his brilliance, I think, lay in the ability to show a panel trying to adhere to the law how it was possible to do so and still do justice in the case. It is a quality that a truly brilliant lawyer has. I remember when he came to the court and met Alex McNeil, who was then the administrator of the court. Alex explained to him that we all got our lawyers' digests each year. That's a red book, a red-backed book that has in it the telephone, the entire listing of the whole bar of the Commonwealth, the telephone numbers of every lawyer, all the courts, how to reach them, what the contact information is. It's a perfectly wonderful book. It's used all the time. And in the appellate courts, I don't know if it's true in the Superior Court, but we got our copies embossed with our names in gold. And the Alex McNeil would write to Lawyers Weekly each year and tell him the names of the judges in each position. In positions 9 and 10 of the appeals court, Alex would explain that the positions were vacant. And when the books came back from the Lawyer's Digest people, he found 8 of them properly made out to the judges, and 2 of them made out to Judge Vacant. When George came to the court in 1989, he filled in for Judge Donald Grant, and who was one of the original judges of the court, an absolutely brilliant man, especially book brilliant. He was less concerned than George may have been about doing justice in the case. but it was a noble position to fulfill, to be in that position. He was position number 5 of the appeals court, and George was appointed to it. And I don't know if he appreciated the great honor it was to be in that position. But he was given the Massachusetts Digest for Judge Vacant. And he would, when he wrote notes to Alex McNeil, he would sign them Judge Vacant. The whole thing struck him as very funny. He was someone that he served 13 years on the court. He came in at the time the court was desperate for judges. It had 14 authorized, and it only had 8 judges in place. And he left at a time when the appeals court had been recently expanded to be 25 judges, one of whom was Judge Ellie Cipher, who was George's. The judges being added to the court were greater in number than the judges on the court. Nevertheless, we gave every judge on the court the assignment of being mentor to one of the judges coming in. And the fact that they were staggered over a period of a year gave us a chance to do that. When Ellie Cipher came, she was well known to the court, of course. She had been practicing before it from the earliest days of the court and representing the attorney, the DA in Bristol County with brilliance, I should say. She had the very good fortune of having as her mentor Judge Jacobs. And she was extremely lucky in that. And she was the perfect mentee for George. And George had to leave the court a couple of years after that due to mandatory retirement, a law that I think has come to do terrible injustice. I see many, many judges at the top of their game being forced to leave the public service because of it. It should at least be modified. It would also be a way of if they raised the age to 75, it would be a way of alleviating the hardship of a pension that's not geared to inflation, as most pensions are. But anyway, he was there for the 13 years. He is remembered with enormous fondness by all of the judges on the court. We were all extremely sorry to see him go. We had, he was it sounds silly to say, but he was the miscongeniality of the court. Just a perfect colleague, a brilliant man, and a wise person. I think his sadness at leaving the court was alleviated by being able to teach full-time, teach young law students. It was in his nature to be helpful to young lawyers coming up. He would always help them in very awkward situations. He was a great man, a great friend, We all deeply missed him. I myself had to leave the court about 3 years later. But I'm so glad I was there for the 13 years that George Jacobs was a member of the court. It was that, coupled with the enlargement of the court, made it, I think, my favorite time for being a judge on the appeals court. Should I allow the motion? Attorney General Campbell, the judges of the court have conferred, and they allow your motion to spread the records of this proceeding upon the annals of the court, the records of the court. Thank you, and
Thank you, Chief. That brings to a close the formal proceedings. I would encourage you all to remain with us for a lighter gathering in the Rose Library, a reception to continue this celebration and remembrance of our dear colleague, Justice George Jacobs. With that, these proceedings are adjourned, and I will see you all in the Rose Library shortly.
All rise.